Hello, and welcome to the To Be Like Christ Bible Study Podcast, where we explore and explain one chapter of the Bible at a time. My name is Luke, I'm your host, and today's chapter is Genesis chapter 8. Let's read the text together. I'm going to be reading from the English Standard Version of the Bible, and while I find it in my Bible, if you have a moment, hit the subscribe or the follow button on your podcast player so we can study together again sometime. Genesis 8 has 22 verses. Let's go ahead and read them as we start today. But God remembered Noah and all the beasts and all the livestock that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heavens were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the waters receded from the earth continually. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated, and in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. And the waters continued to abate until the 10th month. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains were seen. At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made, and sent forth a raven. It went to and fro until the waters were dried up from the earth. Then he sent forth a dove from him, to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set her foot. And she returned to him to the ark, for the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took her and brought her into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent forth the dove out of the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and behold, in her mouth was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent forth the dove, and she did not return to him any more. In the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried from off the face of the earth. And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the 2nd month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, "Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth, and be fruitful, and multiply on the earth." So Noah went out, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, everything that moves on the earth, went out by families from the ark. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." So we are now in Genesis chapter 8, and we are in the middle of a story. We're in the middle of the story of Noah and the flood. There's probably a good lesson here, and that is that if you're studying the Bible and you're new to studying the Bible, you might not want to jump into just any old random chapter and try to start understanding what's going on, or thinking that every chapter is the beginning of a new story. The chapter divisions of the Bible actually weren't added to the Bible until much, much later. The original text, the original authors didn't include these chapter breaks. And so it's a man-made kind of invention to help us navigate around the Bible a little bit. And sometimes the chapter breaks are really super convenient and helpful. And sometimes, like when you're trying to read one continuous story, all in one go, and understand that it all is supposed to be connected together, sometimes the chapter breaks can be a little less helpful. But I'd say overall, they're pretty helpful. But you can't actually buy Bibles that don't have the chapter and verse breaks in them, which are really interesting. But all that to say, whenever you're studying the Bible, just remember that there may be context that's really important to what you find in one chapter in previous chapters, and that's the case here. So Genesis chapter 6, the world gets so evil that God decides to destroy it with a flood. He finds a righteous man, though, named Noah, and he decides that he's going to save the human race through this man Noah and his family. So he tells Noah to build an ark. He gives Noah the dimensions to building that ark, and Noah sets to work. Then, in chapter 7, it's time for God's judgment on this wickedness. So Noah and his family and the animals that God decides to preserve get on the ark. Then God sends this global flood over the earth that kills all living things. And so as we ended chapter 7, Noah and his animals and his ark are bobbing along somewhere on earth, waiting for the waters of the flood to subside. And that's what we're going to read about here in Genesis chapter 8. So let's go to our outline now. By the way, you can get this outline for free as a PDF document on our website at tobelikechrist.com. If you want, you can get a physical copy. You can buy them on Amazon. Just search for To Be Like Christ Genesis, and they're under the 5-minute Bible study series, first book in that series. So if you want them all printed off for you in full color as a hard copy, they're available in that way as well. And there's a link down in the description to where you can buy them on Amazon. Hopefully, if I did my job and actually put the link in the description. Sometimes I forget. Our outlines always begin by asking 3 key questions. When did these events take place? Who are the main characters? And where did these events play out? So let's look at when. This is going to be similar to our previous study, so we won't spend a whole lot of time here. According to the genealogical record that's found in Genesis 5, we can get some dates for when exactly these things were occurring in relation to when the earth was created way back in Genesis 1 and 2. God caused the earth to flood approximately 1,650 years after the world was created. So the earth is about 1,650 years old at this point. Noah and his family, we find out from this chapter, were on the ark for a little bit over a year. So we haven't had a whole lot of hints as to how long this was lasting before, but we get a bunch of dates in this chapter. We find out Noah's on the ark a little longer than a year. So that'd be a long time to be on a boat. I hope they didn't get motion sickness, and to be with a bunch of animals. I don't know how the smell was on the ark, but there's only one window and there was a sealed door, so. But the smell is probably not the most key detail for you to focus on in this text. Sorry, I just went down a bit of a chased a rabbit there. But our main characters, again, these are similar to our last chapters. Noah, he's the son of a guy named Lamech. He's from the line of Seth, or the descendants of Seth. Seth was a son of Adam and Eve. So Noah comes along down that line. We also have Noah's wife who's on the ark with him, and then Noah's sons and their wives. They accompanied Noah and the animals, and we're going to read a little bit more about his sons in the future, so that they're kind of background characters at this point, but in the upcoming chapters, we'll get some more details about them, and obviously they're going to be quite significant because they are going to be the fathers of the rest of the human population. So technically, all people on earth today are descendants from Shem, Ham, or Japheth, and those were their names. All right, so that's our when. Those are our characters. Let's talk about where. In the last chapter, we talked about how the flood waters covered the entire earth, including all of the mountains. So what we're talking about here is a global flood. Now, where exactly does Noah launch his ark from? Where does he build his ark? Well, we don't know exactly. The Bible just doesn't give us those details. We don't know his exact location in the original building. We have talked about how the pre-flood earth was probably significantly different geographically than the world after the flood because of the sheer force and continental impact that the flood would have had. So we don't know exactly where Noah launched his ark from, but we do know that as the floodwaters subsided, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. Now in the modern day, where are the mountains of Ararat? Well, we're not exactly sure of that either. There's some debate about that. I would say that most often I hear theories that the mountains of Ararat are located somewhere in eastern Turkey or in the regions of Armenia. That's a whole nother study that you can get into and look at all of the evidence for those things and the suggestions of the mountains of Ararat being elsewhere. You can get into that in your own time. That's not going to be our focus today. But a lot of people think it was over there in that region of the world. I will say that seems to make general sense based on the spread of civilizations that we see after that. But again, don't really have any hard details. There are archaeologists and historians out there looking for remnants of the ark. Some people claim that they found it, but to my knowledge, there has not been any legitimate archaeological discoveries that would suggest that Noah's ark has been found. So now we go over to our outline, and we're going to break this chapter down, make sure we comprehend what we just read before we look at an application for our lives. So I've got 3 sections today. There's 22 verses. The first section is verses 1 through 5. The floodwaters begin to subside. So in the last chapter, we talked about all the floodwaters arriving. Now they're going to subside. When God's judgment on the wickedness of the earth was complete, when the thousands or millions or maybe even billions of people that existed on the earth at that time had been wiped out, apart from Noah and his family, God decided that his judgment was finished and that he was going to remove the waters of the flood from off the earth, and Noah and his family could start again on this fresh, new earth. At the end of 150 days of the waters being on the earth, God created a wind which stopped the water levels from rising and sent them into a gradual decline. The ark, we're told, as I already mentioned, came to rest on the top of the mountains of Ararat. Now keep in mind, just for your ark to run aground on the top of a mountain, you still have a significant amount of water on the earth. It's not like everything's dried up at this point. We're told that in the 10th month, the tops of the mountains became visible. So we're starting to see the tops of the mountains poking through the flood. How many of those Noah could actually see from the ark, we don't know, if any. But around the world, the tops of the mountains, the highest peaks, are becoming visible in the 10th month. So that's about what? If you remember from the last chapter, the flood rain started in the 2nd month on the 17th day. So now, the 10th month, the tops of the mountains become visible. So that's been about 8 months. So this brings us to section number 2, verses 6 through 12. Noah sends out a raven and a dove. Noah here is seemingly beginning to test the water levels and to test how quickly maybe he's estimating how quickly he's going to be able to get off of the ark. And he does this with 2 birds. Noah first releases a raven from the window of the ark. And I suppose he figured that, well, if the raven comes back, I know that it's nowhere close to dry. But it says that the raven went to and fro until the floodwaters dried up. So maybe the raven is flying out as a pretty hardy animal, so it's flying, it's able to find rest on the tops of these mountains, and the fact that it doesn't come back kind of signals to Noah that there's dry land out there and things are beginning to dry out slowly but surely. So in his second test, Noah takes what we may consider to be a more delicate animal, not as hardy, maybe not able to fly quite as far or quite as long. It's this dove. He sends it out, and the dove ends up returning to him. It says that it cannot find a place to land, so it returns to Noah. He waits 7 days, and then he releases the dove again, and it returns to him, but this time it returns to him with a freshly picked olive leaf. So you see the progress here. The first time sends it out, it just comes back immediately. The second time he sends it out, but it comes back with a leaf, which signals what? It signals that there's places on the earth, maybe on sides of hills or the sides of mountains, where things are beginning to grow and to bud leaves. So progress is being made. He waits 7 more days, and then he releases the dove a final time. And this final time, the dove doesn't return to him. Okay, so more progress after this third attempt. Now, to kind of confirm this theory about the raven being more hardy than the dove, and that's why he sends the raven first, I was trying to look up some statistics as to how far a raven can fly and how long they can fly without having to land. And I was doing the same for the dove, and I wasn't really able to find any good information. It didn't look like anyone had spent the time to study this. There was some information for pigeons, which is kind of like doves. Pigeons can actually fly for like 100 to 500 miles in one flight, but it doesn't seem like they can stay airborne as long as many other species. I did find an interesting tidbit, which doesn't relate to any of the birds that we talked about, but will maybe just make you admire God's creation, and that is that there is a bird that can stay airborne for 6 months and even longer. It never has to come down to eat or to drink or to mate or even to sleep. These birds sleep, or a form of sleep, in the air. And the bird that I'm talking about is the swift. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those. They used to be by our house where we lived in Albania. They're super small and super quick birds. And I never would have guessed that they can stay airborne for 6 months. And it seems like unless they're nesting, unless they're sitting on eggs or something, that they pretty much spend their entire lives in the air. And there was one study, one bird that was like maybe tracked that didn't come down from the air for 10 months, which is insane. So while I couldn't find the statistics on the raven and the dove, you can look at the swift. Next time you see a swift, maybe you have to look up a picture online or something. You can tell your friends and you can worship God together over the incredible airborne abilities of such a tiny little bird. So many interesting details in biology like that. It's just like, why did God make it this way? He put so much attention and detail. Like, this bird is so unique. He spent the time to design it. Just amazing. So now let's get into section number 3, which is verses 13 through 22. Noah and his family finally leave the ark. We're told in verse 13 that in the first month, so new year now, the first day of the month, the waters were drying up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and he looks out, and he sees finally that the face of the earth is dry. Now, we don't know if it was entirely dry. Maybe it was still drying out a little bit, because God doesn't let him off the ark quite yet. It's not until about 2 months later, the second month on the 27th day, that God finally gives Noah, his family, his wife, his sons' wives, the okay, and all of the animals to leave the ark. And the Bible tells us something really interesting about the way that they leave the ark. It says that they all go out in families. And that's not just Noah. That also seems to include the animals. So the animals go out in the pairs in which they were collected. And I think that's an important detail because it does show us that, well, sometimes you'll hear people mock the idea that Noah got all these animals on the ark, that he collected them all, and that he got them, organized on here, and that the predators didn't eat the prey animals, and that they were able to do this at all. They just laugh at that idea. Like, that's a ridiculous thing to suggest. But what a text like this one shows us, although it's a very small detail, it shows us that God is in control and miraculously assisting with the gathering process, the feeding process, the organizing all of these animals once they got onto the ark, and now he's even organizing them as they're leaving the ark. So there's a miraculous element to this. People who want to laugh at it, thinking of it through a purely secular or a purely naturalistic lens, they're not really realizing the God who's orchestrating this whole thing. So the animals leave the ark in pairs in their family, in their families, according to their species, I suppose that means. And what we see Noah doing next is building an altar and sacrificing to the Lord. I'd probably be doing the same thing. God has saved me and my family alone. He's given me this tremendous grace. As soon as I have the opportunity to worship on dry land again, I'm going to worship him for his grace, and I'm going to worship for being back on an earth that's dry and not covered in water. So he sacrifices animals when he makes these sacrifices. And this tells us a little bit of the reason why he had to take more than one pair of clean animals. We talked about that in the last chapter. Took 7 pairs of those clean animals. Why does he take so many? Well, partially because he's going to sacrifice some when he comes off the ark. Can you imagine taking one pair of a species of animals and then being like, well, I need to sacrifice, so let's see which one of you are going extinct now. So he sacrifices these clean animals, and he has multiple of them. So the species continues. There was actually a point to saving them. Wasn't going to wipe them out. That would be some unlucky animals if that was the case. But God appreciates this offering that's made. It's interesting. It says that the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. So God smells this burning sacrifice coming up. And that language is used quite a bit in the Bible when it comes to sacrifices. God smells this. He's pleased with this. And he makes some promises. God promised that he would never again strike down every living creature as he had done with the floodwaters. And the chapter concludes with this promise, and this is God speaking. Quote, "While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." So God is promising that he's never going to wipe out all human beings again in this kind of way, and that as the earth exists up until the return of Jesus, until the end of time, that the natural rhythms of the earth are not going to cease, that these things aren't going to be thrown into turmoil in the same way that they were in the past. So that's a very reassuring promise for us. There's going to be some other promises, and a very significant sign of God's promises, the rainbow. Hint, hint for the next chapter. But these are the promises that God makes after he brings this judgment on the world. So we see the anger of God subsiding with the floodwaters. His judgment is finished, and now we're starting over. And in a way, we're starting over the story that we began in Genesis chapter 1, but we have a new earth. We have righteous people on the earth. Let's see what happens. Will things be different? Will they be the same? Will we have the same sin problems? That's all to be discovered as we open up chapter 9 and read through the rest of the Old Testament and into the New Testament. So we'll pick up the story here, but before we finish, let's talk about an application. Our application today is this: God uses the world that he has created for his purposes. Although God promised not to flood the earth again and destroy all mankind that way, he hasn't removed his hand entirely from his creation. He still uses it to get done what he wants to get done. God still uses the world and the elements in it to providentially guide people to himself, to affect the rise and the fall of nations. We're told that nations and governments don't rise on their own. They rise and fall based on whether God wants them to or not. How could he do that? Well, perhaps he's put natural resources in a country to make them rich and wealthy and to bring them to prominence in a particular generation. He also uses nature sometimes to crush nations. Now, we don't know how all of this works. This is part of God's providence. It's part of his organizing the world. God may use nature to judge the wicked. He may use nature, well, we know he definitely uses nature to teach lessons to human beings, right? Like in Matthew 6, when Jesus is talking, he's preaching, he's talking about the lilies of the field and how beautiful they are. He says the lilies of the field, God takes care of all of them. He dresses them up in these beautiful colors and provides for them. He said, why are you worried about your life? If God is on your side, certainly you are much more than lilies. You're much more important to God than flowers. It says you see the sparrows, the little birds that fly around on the ground, they always find something to eat. Why are you anxious? If God feeds these, you're much more important than these. Of course God's going to take care of you. Stop worrying and start trusting in God. So that's a natural lesson that we can learn. And Jesus obviously used tons and tons of parables about natural processes to teach us things. God might change the trajectory of someone's life by bringing them in contact with some kind of natural force or some kind of natural event. Or he may cause someone to worship through nature. You go to these magnificent places that God's created, and there's a welling up in your heart to worship something. And that's supposed to draw you towards God. Look out into space. You look at these animals like the swift that flies around for 6 months and never needs to land. That should spur your heart on to worship. So he may use worship for that, or he may use the natural world for that purpose. Nature and weather are a complex and a powerful tool that's at God's disposal and that he still uses in the modern day to lead people to him, to punish the wicked, and to accomplish what he wants in the world. So don't think that there's this distinction between, well, there's the natural and then there's the spiritual and there's no overlap and God's just kind of sitting up in heaven watching everything play out. No, that's not it at all. And as we read the rest of the Bible, we'll find that God countless times uses natural forces to accomplish spiritual goals. So that is Genesis chapter 8. That is our application. One thing that we can take away from this, and obviously there's a lot of other things. Let me know in the comments section if you can think of any other applications from this chapter. Thanks for studying along with me today. Remember to leave a review if you haven't already in your podcast player, if that's available to you. And Lord willing, I will talk to you very soon. We'll talk about Genesis 9.